The winter of 1884 did not arrive with a warning. It struck like an executioner, its first breath tasting of wet sheep wool and old iron before the sky bruised into the color of a fresh beaten eye. Caleb Vance lived 4 miles outside of Deadwood on a shelf of limestone and red clay called the Devil's Tongue, a miserable patch where nothing grew save for prickly pear and scrub oak. When Caleb first dragged his broken-down wagon up that track 5 years prior, his boots wrapped in burlap because the soles had long since given way to the gravel, the men down at the Golden Nugget Saloon had set down their whiskey just long enough to hoot him out of sight. "Look at the old fool," Miller, the dry goods merchant, had shouted from his porch, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Bought himself a tombstone before he even bought a plow. Caleb hadn't looked back, though his left hip carried the steady hitch of a man who had spent 6 years swinging a heavy sledge for the Union Pacific. He had 2 horses, one blind, one coughing gray phlegm, and a wagon loaded with 200 saplings wrapped in damp burlap. They weren't fruit trees, nor were they timber for a barn. They were Lombardy poplars and native juniper, switch-like things that looked more like handfuls of gray wire than the backbone of a forest. For 3 weeks while the frost bit at the shallow creeks, Caleb didn't use a plow on the stubborn limestone. He used a round-pointed shovel, a mattock, and his own bent back, digging holes 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide in a tight, double-layered ring 20 paces from his sod-roofed cabin. The townsfolk rode past his fence line on Saturdays, reining in their mounts just to watch him sweat under the blazing sun. "Hey there, Vance," hollered young Tom Gannon, whose daddy owned half the valley bottom. Planting a graveyard for those miserable nags, or expecting the cavalry to hide behind those toothpicks? Caleb never stopped digging, hurling red clay over his shoulder and wiping his forehead with a cracked, calloused wrist. He looked up with washed-out blue eyes that had seen too much alkali dust, and he didn't say a single word, his stubborn silence driving them wilder than a curse. "Let the old man dig," Miller would yell back, spurring his bay. "When the real winter hits, those little sticks won't even boil a kettle of shoe leather." They called his place the Fool's Corral, laughing over penny cigars in the mercantile about why a man would waste sweat on trees instead of stacking cedar logs for a proper, 4-inch thick wall. Caleb couldn't explain it to men who measured everything by what it fetched at the assay office. He had survived the winter of '78 up in the Montana foothills, where the snow drifted 20 feet high and the wind pressed like a solid wall of absolute zero, sucking the breath out of a man before he could cross his own threshold. Trees didn't just grow, they deflected, turning a roaring horizontal wall of ice shards into a gentle, settling powder. By the 4th summer, the poplars stood 30 feet high, their crowns arching inward like the ribs of a cathedral nave to turn the yard into a cool, green well of shade while a thick, prickly hedge of juniper choked out the sage below. And then came November of 1884. The warning didn't come from the sky, but from the wildlife, as a strange, absolute silence settled over the hills and the deer cut deep tracks heading south toward the pine forests 3 days early. Caleb checked his provisions, 2 sacks of hard winter wheat, half a side of salt pork hanging from the ceiling beam, a keg of pickled herrings, while through his greasy window, he watched his poplars. They weren't swaying, they were trembling, every single leaf turned edge-on to the north as if the air had curdled. Down in the valley, Deadwood bustled with noisy confidence, wagons clattering, the blacksmith's hammer ringing out a steady clink-tonk, and the Red Dog piano tinkling cheerful ragtime tunes into the draw. By noon, the sun was snuffed out like a candle under a wool blanket, and the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in 20 minutes, turning the mud into gray iron. Caleb pulled on his heavy buffalo hide coat and beaver skin cap, stepping outside for his final rounds just as the wind hit him, not a whistle, but a physical blow heavy with white needle ice screaming off the Arctic cap. Down in the valley, the blacksmith's hammer stopped dead. At the edge of his clearing, outside the green ring, the wind was an absolute fury, ripping a shingle off his empty shed and batting it into the gray abyss. But as Caleb stepped inside the circle of poplars, the roar dropped to a low, sullen growl, the 30-foot trunks groaning and bending inward as they split the main force of the gale and sent it soaring safely over the cabin roof. Inside the ring, the snow fell straight down like soft feathers in an empty church, and Caleb bolted his door from the inside with a 4-inch oak timber. In Deadwood, the blizzard hit like a falling mountain, driving horizontally across the valley in a blinding whiteout that plunged the temperature to 30 below zero while winds shrieked through the wooden streets at 70 miles an hour. In the Gannon household down by the creek, the family huddled around a stove glowing cherry red, Old Man Gannon wrapped in a wool blanket while Tom hammered Persian rugs over the baseboards to stop the floorboard drafts. The roof. Tom's sister screamed from the upstairs landing as the wind caught the west-facing gable with a pistol crack sound, lifting it 3 inches and letting in a sheet of snow before slamming it back down. "We're losing the house," Miller said, having fled his mercantile earlier, looking twice his age as he sat on the floor with his knees pulled to his chest. "The lumber's green. If this holds till midnight, it's all coming down." Up on the Devil's Tongue, Caleb Vance sat by a modest, steady hearth, whittling a latchpin out of seasoned ash while the cabin held a comfortable, livable 45 degrees. He ground out coffee beans, boiled black water with a pinch of chicory, and sipped the bitter brew as a dull, rhythmic thud-thud-thud sounded against his front door. Unfazed, Caleb set down his cup, lifted the heavy oak bar, and pulled the door open an inch. A frozen, salt-crusted figure slumped inward across the threshold, a gloved arm hooked over the frame. "Vance," a voice croaked like dry corn husks in the dark. "For God's sake." Hauling the frozen body inside with a single, effortless heave, Caleb slammed the door shut against the howling gale and dropped the bar back into place. It was Tom Gannon, crusted in 6 inches of rime ice, his lips blue-black and his fingers curled like dead spiders from frostbite. "Get up, boy," Caleb commanded, dragging him straight into the back room where the flour sacks were kept. Stripping off the frozen coat, Caleb grabbed dry wool blankets and a basin of cold spring water, working his hands and face with relentless, steady friction. "Our house, it's gone," Tom whimpered, his teeth clicking like dice as the blood began to pink up his skin with a sharp sting of returning pain. "Pa's still down there in the kitchen." "Shut your mouth and keep your blood moving," Caleb replied flatly, forcing lukewarm chicory down the boy's throat until he coughed and heaved, his chest finally expanding with warm air. When Tom lay back against the salt sack staring up at the dark rafters in silence, Caleb walked back out to the main room, picked up his tin cup, and resumed whittling his ashwood latchpin. By dawn on Thursday, the wind stopped as abruptly as if a giant valve had been shut off, leaving a heavy, absolute silence. Caleb pushed open his front door into a blinding explosion of diamond-white light, the snow piled 12 feet deep against his northern wall while the poplars stood tall, straight, and green-tipped against a brilliant blue sky, having successfully protected every inch of the yard. Looking down toward Deadwood, the town resembled a slaughterhouse, the Gannon house completely flattened and other roofs stripped to their black interior rafters like stranded whale ribs, while blanket-wrapped figures began to crawl slowly out of their doorways. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open as Tom Gannon stepped out into the sunlight wearing an oversized flannel shirt and spare wool socks, his face gray and swollen, his lips crusted with yellow scabs. He stared down at the ruined valley, then slowly looked up at the 30-foot poplars curving gracefully overhead, their silver trunks forming the quiet, impenetrable fortress that had held the sky at bay. Standing in total silence at the edge of the clearing where the windbreak met the devastated slope, Tom watched the first thin wisps of smoke rise from the distant ruins as men began the long work of digging themselves out, while Caleb Vance leaned his shoulder against the porch post, calmly rolling a smoke with the steady hands of a man who knew the true cost of surviving a frontier winter.